Most of you probably know Bill is from Long Island, from Babylon, and he was a captain in the Navy. He's a Navy SEAL, and he is, when he went to NASA, he's been on 3 shuttle missions. First commander of Expedition 1, which went to the International Space Station. He's got a nice program for you this evening, so let's give a warm welcome to Bill Sheppard.
Thank you, Carol, and thanks to all the people that came out tonight. I'm going to put Carol in the museum a little bit on the spot here. Next, I'm going to do it. You don't go away. You might have to answer some questions here. So next summer, end of the year, next year, well, June 29th, there's going to be a big event here for the 50th anniversary of the moon landing. So as a run-up to that, the museum's trying to organize events such as this, where people talk and kind of give some perspective on the space program. So tonight, I got the dot. So let me start with growing up in Babylon. My dad was a Navy pilot, and he was an engineer. He worked for a company called Fairchild, and they used to have a division in Bayshore called Stratus. But it was a really interesting time because in this community in Babylon, we had any number of families who worked in aerospace, and many of the people were involved in the space program. I can think of some of the names. The Retaliators are here. Their dad worked for Grumman, a guy named John Titterington, good family friend, Grumman. Fred Braden, who worked for Sperry. Charlie Foss, Tom Hanaway. These were all my dad's contemporaries, and they played a role in aerospace and defense. They really defined the center of Long Island as a real powerhouse in aerospace. That's all gone now. I don't know that it will ever come back, or even if it should come back, but that was the kind of the environment that I grew up in. One of the things that I got to do in a tour I had at the end of my government career was, I was born in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. My dad was working on a contract that Fairchild had, and this was with the Department of Energy, and nobody really knew much about what was going on. And I found out much later that what Fairchild and others, including General Electric and General Dynamics, what they were working on, they were trying to build a nuclear-powered airplane. This is 1948, 49, 50, a nuclear-powered airplane. So in my government career, I had a chance to do some liaison with all these government labs. And one of the places that I visited that helped with a lot of the SEAL stuff that we were doing was Oak Ridge. And so I knew I was going to be visiting, and I had talked to the guys up there, and I said, hey, I'm from this area, and my folks lived here, and my dad worked in the Oak Ridge complex. I don't know exactly where or exactly what he did, but I told them what the project was about, and I said, if there's anything in the file that I could see that you could show me, I'd really be interested in seeing that. So I got there, and they filled the room, they turned the lights down, and they filled the screen with about an hour of slides and briefings and pictures on the nuclear-powered airplane program. And I was frankly just blown away with the audacity of these people. And so how does that relate to the Apollo and the moon program? I think it's the same thing. I think the idea of having a man go to the moon, come back safely to Earth, that Kennedy announced in 1961 after Alan Sheppard flew a suborbital flight that took 15 minutes and went about 150 miles up into space and came back. And about 3 weeks later, Kennedy said, hey, we're going to go to the moon. And if that's not the definition of audacity, I don't know what is. So these are the things that were very current when I was growing up, and it didn't seem like it was anything unusual. That was just the way things were. And I don't think it's unique to Babylon, and maybe not even to Long Island, but those were the attitudes and the cultures that my generation grew up with. And I have to say now things are different. Space has become much more a commercial enterprise, and I would think that there might be a way for NASA to get back some of that verve, if you will, in doing things like going back to the moon or maybe on to Mars. And we'll talk about that after a bit. Apollo. Apollo was done in stages. There were many moving parts to it. I'm sure there are probably some people. Anybody here work on Apollo? What'd you do?
Worked in program management.
Yeah, okay, very good. Yeah. So Apollo had a big engine program. They had a big Saturn rocket program. They had a cryogenic engine development. They had spacecraft. They had computers. Then they also had phases of flight operations, which included rendezvous and docking, spacewalking, and a lot of other stuff that had never been done before. And this was all laid out in the early 60s, maybe 62. And if you go back and you find the diagrams from those original designs for how humans were going to go to the moon, it all played out pretty much the way it had been drawn 6 or 7 or 8 years before, which in itself is really amazing. The thing that I feel now is that the programs that I worked on, Space Station was the last thing that I was involved in. And NASA approached that pretty much the way that they did to develop Apollo. All the space station's functional capabilities were segmented into little project offices. And there's good and bad about that. The thing that was different about the space station was that instead of doing a large program all by ourselves in the United States, we had 15 other countries who were playing roles in this, and the biggest of those 15 were the Russians. And so that brought a whole new dimension to how this had to be done that NASA had not really come to grips with before. And for me, it was a very interesting experience, and I still think today there are many lessons that we've learned that we have yet to really take to the bank about how to do very large, complex programs, certainly ones of international flavor, and doing that successfully. So what I'd like to do, I spent 13 years in the Navy. I applied for the astronaut program twice. On my second go-around, I got selected. I went down to Houston in 1984. I trained up as an astronaut candidate, as one of the astronauts who do the spacewalks, handle the robotic arms, and manage the many payloads that the space shuttle operates when they're in orbit. And those were my jobs. I flew 3 flights. And then 1992, I got assigned to the space station program to try and figure out how to put this all together. And I was in management for about 5 years, and then I was on the first crew. We trained from middle of 1996 till October 31st, 2000 when we launched. And about 2/3 of our training was conducted by the Russians in Moscow, because almost all the hardware and procedures and computers and everything else that we had to deal with was being made by the Russians. So that was a little more of a march than I had expected to get another space flight, but that's what it took, and it worked, and that's in large part what people do now. They do about half their training in the U.S. and the other half in Russia, because the station really is got a fundamental core that's part U.S. and part Russian. So, Jesse, if we could bring the lights down and start the video, I'm going to show you what the first expedition looked like when we flew in space in 2000 on our mission. This is our crew patch, Gidzenko, Kriklev, Sheppard, two Russians and me. Here we are. We're in the largest swimming pool in the country, practicing with our spacesuits, and we go outside in a vacuum, and in the suit, we weight the suits down so that we're neutral in the water, and it's kind of like being weightless in space, as long as you move slowly. And we trained, we thought we were going to have a number of spacewalks. We ended up not having any. But we trained for a lot of contingencies, things that would break outside that we had to go out and fix. And fortunately, or unfortunately, we never had a chance to go outside and fix anything, so we didn't do any walks. This is the secret Russian training base outside of Moscow called the Gagarin Center. And I'm in the Soyuz capsule trainer with Yuri. He's a MiG-21 pilot. And we're practicing an emergency re-entry back to the Earth in the Soyuz capsule. And so part of the training is also survival work. We have a boilerplate capsule here, also called Soyuz. And we're in the Black Sea here, and the Soyuz is your emergency way home, and sometimes it can land in strange places like the water. And we're practicing signaling the rescue crew. And here we are in a forest outside of Moscow, and this is, again, practicing an emergency descent where we might come down in the woods somewhere in the middle of winter. And this has actually happened to a Russian crew many decades ago. So it was kind of like camping in the winter, and I'd done a lot of that in the Navy, so I had a pretty good time with us. So 1998, the first of three big pieces of our station go up. This is a large rocket called a Proton, and the black thing is a shroud around the first module. Weighs about 20 tons. It gets launched from Kazakhstan out in the desert in Central Asia, goes up into space about 200 miles, and then a month later the shuttle comes up, catches it, and hooks up the second piece. It's called the U.S. node. Sergei was on that flight as well, and he's inside floating around. Here we are again in another very classified Russian facility looking at the service module. This is our living quarters we're going to live in for 4 or 5 months while we're on orbit, and we're looking at the last part of its construction. Here, the service module, again, is being launched from Kazakhstan to go up and be the third central piece of the station that we need to have a home in space. So this is the late summer 2000. We're in Red Square. We're laying flowers on Yuri Gagarin's tomb, and then it's off to the Cosmodrome down in Kazakhstan. The town's called Baikonur. And we are kind of in the middle of a lot of routine, checking things out. Our free time, we had a chance to go next to the museum where the Russians have cataloged about 70 years of their space activity, and we're signing logbooks and things. But really the coolest part about all this was, besides all the memorabilia in the museum, we went next door, and you'll see us come out here in just a second. Right next door to the museum is this cottage. These were the quarters that Yuri Gagarin and his backup were in April 1961, when he was the first human to fly in space. 3 days before our launch, our booster rocket with our capsule on top of it comes out on a rail car, and the Russians run this out to the launch pad, and it goes up on a big hydraulic erector and gets its final checkout, propellants, and gets ready to go fly. And here it is on the launch pad. We get up October 31st early in the morning, get cleaned up. Everybody signs their name on the back of their door. After a little breakfast, we have a little religious ceremony here. This guy threw about a pint of water on everything he could reach, including the cameraman. We go down to the checkout area. We put our suits on. Yuri's going to fly the booster rocket up into orbit. He salutes the general in charge of the launch area, and off we go to the vehicle. So here we are, launch day. It's about, I think it's about 7 o'clock in the morning, and we're right at the base of this rocket with 300 or 400 people right around, and half of them are smoking, and the rest of them are drinking. And you're near about 600,000 pounds of stuff that all it needs is a little spark, and it's going to go boom, you know. And I'm going like, this is a whole different program they got here. So 10:30 in the morning. This was actually a day that it was foggy. NASA would not have flown on this day because you can't see anything.
2, 1. We have ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of the Soyuz rocket, beginning the first expedition to the International Space Station and setting the stage for permanent human presence in space.
So they light up the main engines. They're liquids. They're very smooth. Lots of acceleration. 3 Gs, 3 times the force of gravity, pulling you back in your seat. And about 9 minutes later, we're high enough and fast enough that we're above the atmosphere, and we're traveling so fast that we're going to be in a circular orbit around the surface of the Earth, not coming back anytime soon. So this is a camcorder. I'm waving around inside the crew capsule on ascent.
Start though, good start.
Now we see our visors are up, we're weightless, and the engines are shut down. I'm trying to tell the first joke in space in Russian, and I'm kind of struggling with it because I don't know what all the words are, but it's kind of like a SEAL phrase, something that a mission that starts good will be good. This is the Russian translation. So here, a couple hours later, we do about 2 orbits. The ground checks to make nothing's leaking, and we can take our suits off. So here we are, kind of stretching out inside a living compartment just above our capsule. And where we are in space is we're in the same plane as the space station, but we're well behind it and well under it. And every time we revolve around the Earth, we catch up a little bit to it. So it's a 2-day process of waiting to get up to it. And for sleep, Yuri's in his couch in the Soyuz capsule in the middle there. And Sergei's waving the camera around up in the living compartment. And you'll see a suit that we're drying out because they get kind of sweaty on the first day of the mission. And then Sergei and I would sleep up in the living quarters. And I'm kind of playing possum here, but when you want to sleep, you got to tie yourself off to something because otherwise you're going to be drifting and bumping around. And I pulled my collar up over my eyes because it gets light and dark about every 35 minutes up there, so you want something over your eyes. So this is going to be our home. That's what the station looked like. This is the 2nd of November, 2000. And we're a mile or so away. And the Soyuz is going to dock itself by an automatic radar system. You see the little radar spinning there. And we're flying right into the back end of it. We're going to go right up in that cone there, just to the left of the crosshair. This is a TV picture from a long-range camera that got sent to Moscow. If you listen carefully, you can hear some strange words. And it says in Russian, we have contact and we have mechanical capture. So we open the hatch and we're getting in.
As the real opening of the international space frontier, not just for a country, but for Russia, America, Europe, Japan, Canada, and all that are to follow.
So this is November. Our work was really to try and assemble all the interior pieces of the space station and make it habitable. And we were kind of hands-on, tool kind of guys, so this was actually a lot of fun. This is probably the best part of the mission right here, just making things work. Here he's talking to Moscow. The screens in the back are little control screens on laptops. This is how we manage all the station systems. Yuri and Sergey were assembling part of the air conditioning system now. And then 10 days after we got there, our first supply vessel came up. This is called Progress. And it's also a small capsule like a Soyuz, but it's full of water, food, oxygen, film, anything you might need. Yuri had to take control. Its radar had some problems that day. He docked it manually. And we got inside and opened her up and got it all the goodies. About 2 weeks later, the first shuttle came up. We had 3 shuttle visits. This is Endeavour. This is the first one. And they're bringing up a large solar array that's going to help give us some more electrical power. And they had a series of spacewalks. 2 astronauts went outside on 3 walks to make all the mechanical fastening, hook up all the plumbing, turn all the wiring on. And this resulted in about 25 kilowatts of electric power. It's enough to run a couple houses. And this is the first of 4 big arrays that are presently on the station now. This is the first one going up. So in the spacewalking, we had to have the inside of the station at sea level pressure, and the shuttle operates.
The crew request permission to come aboard. Endeavour, permission granted.
I got to interrupt here.
Endeavour, arriving.
Any Air Force guys in the crowd? I see a hand or two, yeah. For the Air Force, we're going to be doing this in space for about the next 1,000 years. So just get used to it. Now, the shuttle had to operate at a different pressure for the benefit of the spacewalkers, so we had to wait about a week before we could open the hatch and exchange things between the crews. So the shuttle departed. The rest of the winter we're running around inside the crew module fixing things. And exercise was a big part of our day. We had a bicycle, treadmill that Yuri's on here, and we also had a little jungle gym thing. And it's kind of like a Bowflex or something like that. And it turns out that resistive exercise like this is very important, keeping your bones the way they need to be. And the highlight of the day was to get at the food. We had a little galley there. And it really became an important routine for the crew. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner, we all got together, discussed what we were going to do that day, how things were going, who needed help, and it was quite a good experience in terms of how the crew paced itself during the day. Sergey's making a bag of Russian soup called borscht, and it turned out that I like the Russian cuisine a lot better than what they had on the U.S. side. I don't know why, but the Russian cooking doesn't have a very good reputation, but I thought it was great. So here we are at the galley table, kind of mapping out the day. And all you kids would really like being in space because you can play with your food and it's okay. And my sleep station's right behind me there, and Sergey's was on the other side.
And liftoff of Space Shuttle Atlantis with Destiny.
January 2001. The second shuttle's coming up with the centerpiece of the U.S. Research. It's a big lab called Destiny. It's up there now. It's full of stuff. And it's kind of the same drill. The shuttle docks at the station, uses the arm to move the module. Astronauts go outside and hook everything up. It takes about 3 spacewalks to do all that. But some really interesting things. Here's Tom Jones, NASA astronaut, just hand walking outside somewhere. And here we are looking at the, I guess this is Bob Kirby. I mean, he's opening a cover, and he's going to look through an optical window, and I'm on the other side of that window looking at him. I got a golf shirt on, and I'm very comfortable. He's outside, total vacuum, minus 250 degrees. But that's just the way it is.
About a little over 30 feet, hatch to hatch.
and it's full of bays for racks. We have 6 areas here. We're going to put experiment racks in. And forward, you'll see the hatch where the shuttles will be docking in the future when they come to visit Alpha.
This is an APCO that's been signed by all the folks who worked on the lab, and creators in the lab. They should be very proud of it. We're proud of it. We're going to bring that home so that they can display it down at the Cape.
So after a week of spacewalking and almost a week of
Atlantis departing.
crew cargo transfer stuff, Atlantis crew gets back in their vehicle, we close the hatch, and we watch them depart. It's kind of hard because we knew all these people really well. We worked with many of them for years. Our mission, the duration was not fixed at that time. We didn't know if we were going to be up for another couple of weeks or another couple of months, and they're all going to be back on the beach drinking margaritas in about a day. Sergey's talking to Moscow on the radio here. And the docs wanted us to make sure we were still alive. We had these checkups we had to do every month. And I'm trying to find Yuri's liver. And Sergey says, Yuri's a big drinker. And Sergey says, well, he doesn't have one anymore. Every couple of days we had to bag up the garbage. And after we unloaded the supply vessel, we used the bilge on the supply vessel to put all the garbage in. And then when it's full, we undock it, goes into the upper atmosphere and burns up. It's a Russian system and it works pretty well. So this is March 2001. This is Discovery coming up. They have 2 missions. One is to bring up a logistics module. Second one is to swap out the first expedition crew with the second. And you'll see that here in a second. There's a logistics module. And here we are opening it up for the first time. It was intended to be an up and down way to move really big things from the ground to space and back. But it's now, since we've retired the shuttle, that module is part of the permanent capability on ISS. Being weightless has some real advantages.
Here's Jim
Voss.
single-handedly extracting a rack from the MPLM overhead.
This rack is 800 pounds. He's moving it with 2 fingers.
First expedition crew is present and accounted for. Change of command is an ancient naval tradition. The passage of responsibility for mission, welfare of crew, and integrity of vessel from one individual to another. Space Station Alpha has been commissioned in orbit. The service module has been activated. The power element and laboratory module have been brought aboard. A successful resupply mission with Discovery and her crew is complete. Station is at normal condition. All systems functional and ready to carry out operations. We are on a true spaceship now, making our way above any earthly boundary. We are not the first crew to board Alpha or the last to depart, but we have made Alpha come alive. We gave her a name and put substance to the ideas that our crews can work together as equals and our countries as partners, that we may proceed with bolder and more enterprising voyages in space, with benefit from our differences and with a stronger purpose in our common goals. We pass to your care Alpha's log with the hope that many successful entries here are recorded, that explorations are prodigious and discoveries wondrous. May the goodwill, spirit, and sense of mission we have enjoyed on board endure. Sail her well. I am ready to be relieved.
And I relieve you.
So all you Navy guys know, we do change of command in the Navy, and they do it in space. And again, for the Air Force, they're going to do this for the next 1,000 years. So we undocked on Discovery. It's the first chance we had to see what our home in space, how it had grown in the 4.5 months that we were there. A day and a half later, we made a night landing down at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. This is a night shot of the shuttle coming down the runway.
Main gear touchdown. Kelly will be deploying the drag chute a moment from now. Discovery rolling out on runway 15 at the Kennedy Space Center, wrapping up a 5.3 million mile mission, bringing home the first residents of the International Space Station after 4.5 months in orbit.
So we get the shuttle stopped, climb out of our suits, go back to the quarters in Florida. Then the next day we pile on an airplane and we're on our way back to Houston. And we get to meet all the operational folks that support us during our mission, the training staff, and a lot of the key NASA managers that were responsible for writing the checks and keeping Congress under control while we did it. And but the really cool part was when it was all done. It's another tradition for Houston. They generally have a large gathering of folks that had something to do with the mission in a big hangar. And so it was a hangar full of people. There were my 2 dogs. They hadn't seen me for 8 months. They hadn't seen my wife for 2 weeks. So guess who they wanted to jump on? But of course, she feeds them, so what can you say? So it was a real good hour of yelling and screaming and speeches and stuff. And when that all quieted down, we had some good time with some other families of the astronauts and cosmonauts and flight doctors and people who, again, were intimately involved, many for years, in making our flight a success. Yuri and one of the sons. And I was trying to get my dogs to figure out who the heck I was. They finally got the word here. And that was our flight. Jesse, if we could bring the lights up, that was our mission. So I think we got time for some questions, right? We good? Okay. So happy to answer questions. Go ahead, sir. Yeah, I'm going to repeat your question so everybody hears it. How long did it take me to readjust to 1G after we got back? It's not a simple answer because you're affected lots of different ways when you've been in space versus when you're normally in 1G. One of the biggest things is your balance. And this is because your inner ear has fluid in it. It tickles these hairs, and because the fluid's being pulled on by gravity, this is part of your sense about which way is up and which way is down. But in 0G, it's kind of like a computer that got the software messed up, and you lose this sensation. So when you come back, it takes most people 3 or 4 days for that sensation to be at all normal, and that was the case for me. People tend to lose bone density. We still don't completely understand that. Your bones are these big sponges full of minerals. And if you don't have a lot of load on your bones, you tend to, by the process of going to the bathroom, you tend to blow off a lot of calcium. It's not a huge concern on a short flight, but the research says that we don't know a way to completely stop it. We're making progress, but it's still a factor. So if you're weightless for months and months and months at a time, you go to Mars, you run around, you come back, and you're weightless again for months and months and months and months. Are you going to be physically sound when you get to the surface of the Earth? That's still a question. And that's one of the biggest reasons why the research on the space station is so important. That's the only place we can get these answers. Another big one is cardiovascular fitness, your ability to burn oxygen and do work. that wasn't as much of an issue, but if you think about it, when I came back to Earth, I had several kind of casual times with friends and relatives, and I tell people where I was at. I'd be sitting at like a table, and I'd be drinking a cup of coffee or something and talking to people, and I would tell them beforehand. I said, "Look, I'm gonna move here, and it's gonna look really strange, and it's okay if you say something, but I'm totally okay, but this is gonna look real funny." And somebody over here would ask me a question, and I would literally do this, and I'd look at them, and I'd answer the question, and somebody else would say something over here, and I'd go back like that, and I'd talk to them. And I said, "This is because you've been in space for 5 months, and you don't have to do any of this stuff that we would normally do, picking something up off the floor or shooting a basketball or anything like that. The twisting, complex motion that we do every day on Earth, you don't do it up there. And so when you're trying to reaccommodate back on Earth, it all feels, you're real stiff and you don't feel good doing it. It's not neuromuscular. It has to do with your flexibility and what your muscles are happy with doing, and most times they're not happy. Biggest thing that I can say about readaptation is the morning after we got back to Florida, we had to pile into a van, and we had to go somewhere for some kind of testing and a medical test. And so we walked out in the parking lot. And it was really early in the morning. I think it might have been a Sunday. There was nobody, big open parking lot, nobody there. So, and when you're walking around, you have 2 doctors right with you, side by side, because some people still are a little bit shaky and they don't want you falling down and breaking your ankle. And so I talked to my lead flight doc and I said, "Terry, how about letting me drive?" Terry looked around if anybody was watching, and he said, "Okay, just take it real easy." So I said, "I just want to get in, just want to see what it feels like." So I got in the van and I drove around the parking lot real slow. And I was real good going straight, and I could turn as long as I didn't do it too aggressively, and I could brake and accelerate. I got out of that van, and I'm thinking about what crews would have to do to go to Mars, be weightless for a long time, land on the surface, get out, and drive something around on the Martian surface. And I slammed the door, and I thought to myself, we can do this. It's a very doable physical task. Young man, your question.
And I also, I met another astronaut, and he said his friend went to space too, and he said he wasn't used to gravity, and he was holding a stack of plates and just let go of it.
Yeah, that's happened. People that come back, they don't get used to gravity, and they forget that they're not in space anymore, and they'll put a pen up like they're going to come right back to it while they do something, and they reach back, and it's on the floor. Young man. How old do you have to be to train at NASA? It's a couple, there's no fixed age. They want people that have finished college, and most people there have had a lot of college, so they're in their late 20s by the time they're ready. And you don't want to have people that, if you have to wait 6-8 years for a flight, you don't want to be in a regime where you might be unhealthy. So the average age of astronauts coming in between about 27 to maybe 35. Occasionally they'll take people who are 40, but it's unusual. So you got plenty of time. Ma'am.
I'm curious about your Russian conversations. Like, did you learn more Russian? Did they learn more English? Like, how did you converse? And also,
It was kind of a mix. The 2 guys that I flew with, Sergei Krikalev, who was a civilian engineer, he was he was a native English speaker. I mean, the guy was just, he had a little accent, but his comprehension was 100% solid. Yuri was conversant. He was a military guy. You could get by in English, but he would have trouble extemporaneously speaking to a crowd like this, particularly if he didn't know the subject. My Russian got pretty good, and so as a crew, kind of depending on what we're doing. If we're talking to Moscow, we're all speaking Russian. If we're talking to Houston, it's English. If we're talking about something that, those guys would tell me a joke in Russian, and I'd say, okay, what does this mean? And we called it Runglish when we got done. But actually, the best part of that was Sergei was a particularly capable guy, and I think most astronauts and cosmonauts who have had any contact with the Russians would say he's probably the best astronaut or cosmonaut in anybody's program. And he and I saw things from a technical standpoint from a very similar perspective. To give you an example, one day we're in the secret rocket factory. Yuri and I were there. We're getting briefed on this docking adapter. Sergei had a meeting. He couldn't show up at the beginning of the class. He was going to be late. And so the instructors are talking to us about these latches. And so I'm talking to the instructor, and I say, well, this latch here, it's got this electric motor to unlock it. But what happens if that breaks? Is there some kind of override that you can do that gets the latch out of the way? And the guy looked at me like, you stupid Americans, so this is what you do. And you put the ring, all this stuff. And about 15 or 20 minutes later, we're on another part of the docking ring talking about something else. Sergei comes in, he's looking at what we're doing, and he knows this hardware pretty cold because he's seen it before. He's probably been a party to help build it. And he's walking over to this section where we were before. And he looks down at this thing, and he looks at the instructor and says, what happens if this electric thing jams up? How do we unlock it? And it blew this instructor's mind. He thought, I told him, we didn't rehearse this. We are psychic, Our brains are like one, which blew their mind even more. It was kind of fun.
What's the most extraordinary and magical thing about being in space for a long period of time?
What's the most extraordinary and magical thing about being in space for a long time? Wow, big question. I'm not sure I can give you a simple answer. The most interesting thing that happened to me, I would say it's part of the dynamic of being in a crew. And we were very compatible people when we started out on our flight. We had trained together for almost 5 years, and we knew we could get along really well. But the thing that surprised me is week by week as we flew our mission, our cooperation and our ability to perform as a team just got better and better. And, I think every astronaut or cosmonaut would look back on the time that they flew in space, and most of them would want to go back and be part of a team like that again. Very unusual experience. Way in the back there. Go ahead.
Did you carve your initials or anything like that into the space station to leave your mark?
I'll never tell. No, I did do that. I didn't do anything destructive, but I did hide some things here and there, so people would really have to dig to find them. And there was something that we had to do early on that hadn't been planned. It was a duct or an aperture or something that it had to be sealed off to change the flow of the ventilation in one of the compartments. And so we said, hey, no problem, we can deal with it. So we made a cover out of aluminum sheet, and I put it in this part of the duct, and I had written on there, yours courtesy of the Expedition 1 crew, figuring nobody in the lifetime of the space station would ever find it. And sure enough, 5 years later, it came back to me in a box because one of the crews had found it and they had to replace something. They took it out. And it's in the museum. It's in your collection. That piece of aluminum's here in the museum now. It's not on display yet, but it's here. Young lady, yeah.
I want to know what you think is the problem, I would say, with people who say they don't believe that you've been up there, and by the same token, have you seen any aliens and UFOs flying out?
No, I get asked that a lot, and it's a valid question. I don't know, people just believe what they believe. A better answer to a question like that from my standpoint is, did I ever see anything that I didn't really understand? And I would say, yes, happened a couple times. The first one, it's kind of interesting. My first shuttle flight was on Atlantis. We flew for about 5 days. We launched from Florida, flew high inclination, and you get into the polar regions of the Earth, and the radiation there, because of the magnetic field, is a little bit stronger than if you go closer to the equator. And when I was sleeping, I would be kind of half awake, and my eyelids would be closed. But I saw these kind of flashes of light in my eyes, and I'm going, whoa, what is this? Because is something wrong with me? And so I came back, and I had a big debrief. And so when things all quieted down, I talked to one of my docs. And I said, Doc, I don't really want to admit this, but I've seen these little flashes of light in my eyes, thinking I'd be grounded. You're done. And he said, oh yeah, everybody sees that. I'm going like, well, why didn't you tell us about this stuff? That was one. Another one was, we had a day where we were flying, again, in high latitude, and we were going over an area where they had the northern lights. And these are these green wisps of clouds. And because of the orbit we're in, we were actually above the northern lights. And we're looking out, it's kind of dim outside, but you can see this green stuff. And we're going under it, and eventually we're going right through it. And then I saw this stuff up above it that was red. I'm going like, whoa. I've never even heard anything like red up here. So I kept my mouth shut. And then when I came back and I found out, yeah, there are red northern lights, but they're very rare and few people have seen them. So it's kind of cool. But as far as extraterrestrials, I got a theory about that. And that is I call it the beer can theory. And if people wanted to know, particularly you Babyloners, if people wanted to know if Babyloners were around, beer cans would be a sure sign that somebody had been there. And so I think that the first thing we'll see of some other alien life is their equivalent of a beer can. It'll be a piece of trash, it'll be a radio emission, it'll be something they don't want that's headed our way that we detect, and that'll be reason to believe something more is out there. Yes, sir, way in the back. Go ahead.
Yes, have you ever encountered a situation that there's some sort of a cultural conflict between you and the Russian crews?
Yeah, all the time. The crews were pretty tight, but the cultural issues, when you got to the managers and the senior people in both the Russian and the U.S. programs, and also the Europeans and the Canadians, those were pretty ugly. And one of the things that I was able to do, and it was kind of a unique circumstance because because the United States was paying most of the bill for the U.S. and most of the Russian stuff, the U.S. got to call a lot of the shots on how the program was going to go. So I was going to be the guy in charge, which I wanted. The Russians had a lot of problem with this because Sergei, one of the cosmonauts you saw, he had been in space 3 times before, very experienced cosmonaut. One of his missions was over a year long in duration. And Yuri was experienced as well, but not as much as Sergei. And the Russians were saying, look, you got this guy here, and he's not even a pilot, and he's only been in space on 3 short missions. He's had a total of 2 weeks in space, and why is he in charge? And we got past that, but the biggest thing was, because I had worked with lots of military people from foreign countries, I knew a little bit about the thinking of different cultures and particularly military people, and I understood that. And the highlight of my mission was one of the days when we were flying along. We get up in the morning and we'd have messages coming up from Houston about the plan of the day, and I would get a cup of coffee and I'd be reading the stuff on the laptop or taking it out of the printer and reading it, and it would give us instructions on changes for things we were to do that day. Fine. So one of the instructions was, take that thing that you're going to do at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, get rid of it and put this other event in there. I think, is this the microphone that's got the problem? Okay, how about this one? Yeah. And so that was, so Houston would come up and they would say, here's what we want to change for 2 o'clock. 30 minutes later, we'd be flying over the Atlantic, and we'd have a ground station where we could talk to Moscow Control Center. Moscow would say in Russian, they would say, no, that thing that Houston wants at 2 o'clock, take that out, put this other thing in. We said, okay, fine. This happened about 3 times, and the 4th time it happened, and both control centers can hear the crew and each other. And I got on the horn to Moscow. We good? I got on the horn to Moscow and I told him, "Etta blaha buha." That's Russian for that is BS. And the Russians, I found out later, the Russians were in shock because nobody had ever talked to them like that. I mean, your family gets shot like the next day. And the thing was, I said, look, we got one space station here. It's an international program. We got one crew. We're going to execute one flight plan, and that's it. We're not going to do one for Moscow and one for Houston. Over. And, long, silent pause. And then they fixed that. But to be able to crack the whip on both Houston and Moscow, because what we were doing was not just the same old thing. It was something where they both had to make accommodation. That to me was really rewarding, and that was one of the highlights of my time in space. Maybe 2 more questions. Way in the back.
Hi. Yeah, I saw that there was physical fitness as part of your regimen, and I'm curious if there were types of things that you were doing that you were working on there or developing there or now. I mean, I know there's red light therapy, there's hyperbaric stuff. What kind of stuff are they doing for health and wellness now?
Well, it's a whole range of things. What NASA typically tries to do is they will solicit research. So a school, let's say Duke or Penn State or some University of Texas, they'll have a group of people that want to study diet. What's the effect of diet on bone density? Or what's the effect of this kind of drug on your neurovestibular balance? What's the effect of this exercise protocol on your cardiovascular accommodation? And this is going on all the time. So it's hard to say any particular thing, but the space station's been up there 18 years now, and I would say a big part of the research focus for what that thing is doing is this biomedical research. So that's the answer. Young man, I already got you once. Young man here, go ahead.
If you could do one thing to NASA to make it better, what would you do? I was gonna say.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. However, so let me quick story on that. This is a question for the kids in the audience. Adults are not allowed to answer. Okay? Okay, kids, here's the question. Anybody under 18 can answer this question. How How many of you have been on an airplane? Raise your hand. Okay. And if you look out on the wing, and what are the wings doing? Why do you have the wings? Who wants to answer? Go ahead.
To provide lift.
Okay. And so what's holding the airplane up? It's the wings, right? So do the wings, what do the wings look like? What do they, is it just a straight piece of metal or is it something strange? Young man.
It looks kind of like an airfoil.
Very good. Give that young man an A+. Okay. So who said the wing needed to look like an airfoil? Some smart guy a long time ago. A lot of history of that in the museum. So what I'm getting at is the reason I think about the reason why the airplane flies, and I'm getting to the answer to the question, don't worry. The reason why the airplane flies is because all these people are really smart and they knew kind of how the wing had to look. And the guy that designed the landing gear knew how much the legs had to stick out and how much brake force it needed to stop the airplane and all that. And yet the engines had to push so hard and the fuel tanks had to be so big. So when I look at an airplane, I think of why does it fly? It's because these thousands of people, all working collectively on a big program, basically had the right kind of feeling or the right sense about what was the thing that ought to be done. And to me, it's as much about that as the rivets and the metal in the airplane. On to NASA, space flight, and rockets. When I see the rockets take off from Cape Canaveral, particularly NASA's big rockets, I think of, what's really making that rocket fly? And it's in many cases the same thing that the airplane people used to build the airplane, except for one thing. The interest and the support of the people in the country here that want to have a robust space program and want to see NASA and the country go off and do big things in space, that's what makes it fly. And I think that's what NASA is missing now. I'm happy to do what I can to try and get it back. I wish I knew how to do it better. So I think one last question and we're going to call it a night. Young man here.
What kind of health damage does going into space cause?
Health damage? Like to your body? Probably the biggest thing long term, there's two, what's the biggest health damage for going into space? Two long-term things that we're still kind of worried about. One is that you're flying above a lot of the protective layer of the atmosphere, and so the sun's radiation is a lot stronger. And you also have rays that are zinging around the cosmos. Do you know what we call those? Cosmic rays. So you're getting radiation that you normally wouldn't get on the surface. Statistically, it's about the same that we tolerate for people who work on nuclear submarines or in nuclear power plants. And it's kind of a question is how much is too much? We still don't know the answer. On the whole, it can't be real good, but we don't know how bad it is. That's one. The second thing that we just discovered about 3 years ago, some astronauts have relatively permanent changes to the shape of their eyeball, and it affects their vision. And it doesn't happen to all astronauts. It's maybe 10 to 20% of the people who are flying in space, but it is something new. And again, the docs don't understand it. And whether it can be reversed or prevented is still a big research question. If we can't fix those two problems, humans are not going to be able to stay in space in a weightless environment for long periods of time. So we're working on it. Hey, I want to thank y'all. I think we're done with questions.